Hey guys, welcome to the channel. In today's video we are talking about the brand new Remnant 2. This is Fossil21. I love playing games, I love making videos, so if you guys like the video, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. So, to start off, I didn't really play Remnant from the Ashes, the first game. I played about 2 hours when it was the free PlayStation Plus game of the month, and I wasn't really feeling it, so I kind of dropped it. And if I'm being 100% honest, I wasn't really gonna play Remnant 2 as well. There was another game that was coming out around the same time as Remnant, and it got delayed, and so I was like, well, I guess I'll play Remnant 2. And holy crap, I almost missed out on one of the best games I've played this year. This went from me literally not really having an interest to it, to being one of my most favorite games that I've played this year. It like blows my mind. I can't believe that I almost passed this up. The story is definitely not the forefront of the game, and it's mostly vague and isn't really anything to write home about. I almost feel like they came up with all of these really cool areas and were like, okay, now how do we connect all of these together? Because there are some truly awesome areas in Remnant 2. And honestly, it kind of reminds me of this old show, Stargate. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but they go through portals and stuff like that. Very similar to what they do here, except for going through this giant ring, they're touching the crystals and they go to these different worlds. The story kicks off with some random guy named Ford, who we don't really know. He touches the crystal and it sucks him in, and then the crystal malfunctions and sucks in another person that we really don't know named Clementine. And that's pretty much more or less the catalyst for the story. You go in after them to try to save them, and as you're trying to save them, you discover that there's this thing called the Root, which is destroying all these different worlds or realms. Like I said, the story overall isn't really that great. It's not bad, but it's, like I said, nothing really to write home about. And that's kind of really all I'll talk about on the story for those that are invested, because there are a few, I would say, plot twists, some twists and turns here. Overall, I think the story was kind of okay. But the most important thing is that this is what allows you to travel to all of these cool worlds and fight all of these awesome monsters. Gameplay is king, and the gameplay here is freaking incredible. I really enjoyed the gameplay for Remnant 2. It was so much fun and addicting. There's also a lot to unpack here, so let's just start with the weapons. All of the guns felt really good, they felt really punchy, and it was really satisfying taking down all of the enemies with them. Despite all that, this is definitely not a looter shooter. You're not going to be constantly finding gear to find and finding different weapons, better weapons. That said, I don't think I even found a fraction of the weapons that I know are available in the game. And honestly, I don't think I even found a brand new weapon other than like purchasing ones through the store until like 20 or 30 hours into the campaign. So when I actually found a new weapon, it was super exciting. I'd say for the most part, I mainly sticked to a handful of weapons. I used the Bulldog, which is a shotgun type gun, and then I also use the bone saw, which is your more automatic rifle style. But my favorite had to be the Nightfall, which is one of the weapons you get after defeating the Reaver boss fight. You take these crafting materials that they drop and you go take it and you make this cool looking bone like weapon that's got like fingers dangling from it. It looked super cool, it was super creepy. Its special was actually really cool as well. You enter the Nightmare Realm, I believe it's what it's called, and you turn all ghost-like and your weapon goes full auto, dealing crazy damage. Speaking of abilities and mods, there's tons of mods in the game that you can add to pretty much all of your weapons that add an extra ability, whether you could shoot fire rounds, shoot some boss moves that the bosses use. The only ones that couldn't really be swapped out is if you crafted a boss weapon. There usually was a mod or ability that was already in the gun or sword or whatever it was, and it can't be taken out. But anything that's not a boss weapon, you can freely swap between all these different mods. They also have a ton of melee weapons, and actually you can play the whole game melee if you really wanted to. Just like the guns, there's also a ton of them. That said, among my favorite ones was the God Splitter, It wasn't all that great, but it looked really cool. Definitely looked like an homage to the Infinity Blade games. If any of you guys have played that, the sword literally looked like the Infinity Blade. With you going to several different worlds, there are so many different enemies to fight. One world will have you fighting like werewolves and dark elves, and the next world you're fighting robots and aliens. The gameplay mixed with the vast selection of areas and enemies made the core gameplay loop really more fun and addicting. I was so addicted to this game. It was incredibly fun. Last thing that I do want to talk about gameplay wise is the archetypes. The archetypes are kind of like starting classes. When you first start, there are only 4 different archetypes to choose from. You have the medic, the handler, the hunter, and the challenger. And I guess if you pre-ordered, you got the gunslinger. I started out with the challenger, which is kind of like the tank if you're going with classes. You deal a ton of damage, you could take a ton of damage. You're meant to be kind of in the forefront of the battle. This is a 3-person co-op game. You can play up to 3 players or play solo. So especially when you got those 3 players, you get benefits and buffs from being the one that charges in first, opposed to like the medic, who's more benefited from holding back and healing the team rather than being right in the forefront dealing the most damage. There are also a ton of other archetypes that, from what I could tell, can only really be found within the world. For example, I got too close to one of these sewers in Losam, and a werewolf reached out and just snatched me and pulled me in. And after taking out the werewolf, he drops this like gem, I forget what it's called, but it basically you take it to one of the vendors back at Ward 13 and he can craft it into the alchemist archetype for you. Another example is the gunslinger archetype. I got this one by talking to, I forget his name. He's like the old white bearded dude that's got like a pot of stew cooking next to him. More or less, you exhaust all his story dialogue, and eventually he's like, hey, thanks for listening to all my stories. Here's the gunslinger revolver. You take that, craft that so that you can get the gunslinger archetype. There are many more that are in the game that I won't spoil here. Just know that there are way more than just the 4 starting classes or archetypes. So much more. With each archetype, you do get a set of abilities. You do get more as you level up and progress throughout the game. For example, like I said, I did the Challenger. One of the first abilities you get with the Challenger is he has the War Cry Stomp, where he yells and stomps the ground and it shoots a big shock wave going forward, pushing back enemies as well as doing damage. Another example is the Gunslinger. He has his first ability. He whips out his pistol like a standoff and shoots up to, I want to say 3 or 4 enemies, dealing quite a bit of damage to each of them. Another cool part with the archetypes is after you progress a little bit throughout the game, you have the ability to unlock a second archetype, meaning that you can have 2 equipped at the same time, which leads to a ton of build variety. You can have a brawler and a healer at the same time. You can be the gunslinger doing a bunch of damage with ammo reserves and be the summoner all at the same time. So it was really cool to mix and match these different archetypes just to see what builds I can make. Coupled along with the archetypes, there are plenty of rings and amulets that all have various buffs and stat increases. Especially when you have those 2 archetypes, it's really cool to kind of mix and match to try to get the best build that you can. I know there's tons of guides out there. I just kind of experimented with what I thought did the most damage. Talking about armor sets, there are quite a few in the game, but they didn't seem to do all that much. Some of them had more armor, some of them weighed more. I just personally just went with the ones that looked the coolest, and there are definitely some very sick armor sets here. My only real negative as far as gameplay goes is that I felt like the material drop rate was pretty low. Like I felt like it took a long time to get materials to upgrade weapons and swords and things like that. And you didn't get that much. So there's, after you discovering weapons, because you don't find that many to begin with, the ones I did find, it kind of made it hard to justify experimenting with some other weapons, just because I didn't want to level them up because I didn't have that much materials to begin with. So for the most part, I stuck with the Bulldog shotgun, and then after a little while I switched to the Bone Saw assault rifle, and then like I mentioned, I finally got that Nightweaver weapon, and it was so cool that I just couldn't help but dumping a ton of points into. It's not really a negative because you still can grind for things, which I don't want to say grind because redoing the levels was also really fun. Like I said, that only really seemed to apply to the early game. As the game progressed, I got a lot more materials, especially in those harder levels later in the game. But that's really it. Overall, the gameplay was really fun and very addictive. I had so much fun. Along with the gameplay, one of my favorite parts of Remnant 2 was the bosses. Remnant 2 is difficult, especially those bosses, and even more so if you're playing solo. This game is probably the most Souls-like I've played out of all of the Souls-like. All of the bosses were challenging, had multiple phases, were really well crafted, the music was awesome. All around, I thought the bosses were incredibly fun and epic, and were so satisfying when you finally got to beat them. It was a little weird because I played a large portion of this game solo, and I also played a large portion co-op with friends. Sometimes I had 2 other friends, and sometimes it was just me and another friend. And it seemed like some of the bosses were definitely more geared to having a group take them down, opposed to some of them felt more adequate for solo play. For example, the final boss. We had a group of people I had a group of my friends. We were trying to take down this boss for so long. We spent hours trying to take this boss down one day, and we just couldn't get it. We both logged off, hopped on a couple hours later, and found out my friend had beaten the boss all by himself, and then I tried beating the boss, and it only took me a few tries, and I actually got him all by myself, and it just seemed like he was a little bit easier going solo opposed to with a group. And I don't know if that's because when you do play as a group, it adds more health and the boss does more damage. I'm not real sure on the stats for those, but there was definitely some that were more geared to having a group. For instance, there's this one boss, I'm drawing the blank on his name, but he tries to eat you at one point, and I tried doing him solo for so long, and he was difficult. I get in the group, and we beat him basically first try. That said, literally all of the bosses were so freaking epic. My top favorite out of all the bosses, like I mentioned earlier, was that last boss. Was so fun. Had multiple phases, did crazy attacks. And then I would also have to say that the Night Weaver was really cool. It's like this ghost Grim Reaper boss, the one that I got the Night Weaver weapon from. The whole boss fight was just really cool, creepy, and epic. Also, the worlds in Remnant 2 are all procedurally generated. So there are many bosses that I have yet to discover. So many bosses and so many worlds that I haven't even found or even heard of yet. It was just kind of cool because I'd do one run and I would fight, this boss, and then I would hop onto my friend's world and we would do the exact same world, like whether it was Yeisha or Losam, literally did the exact same world, had a totally different setup with its own set of bosses. The replayability is insane. I just find it so fun and fascinating, and overall I just had a blast taking down all of these bosses. They were all incredibly fun and satisfying, and they were challenging. I love when the boss is a little bit challenging. One of the last things I want to talk about in this video is the worlds that you go to in Remnant 2. All of the worlds here in Remnant 2 are all procedurally generated, and what that means is that no 2 run-throughs or playthroughs will be the same. I mentioned earlier I went through one whole start to finish area of Losam, and then went to certain areas, fought certain bosses, then hopped on to a friend of mine's world, doing the exact same world of Losam, had different locations, different bosses. It kind of reminds me of Returnal, where every time you died the world had changed. When you died, the world didn't change. It's just every time that you went to a new world, it was different. And you can re-roll, which they have what's called adventure mode. So after you beat that world, you unlock adventure mode for that world, and you can re-roll it as many times as you'd like. Getting different areas, if you're looking for specific bosses or specific areas, you can re-roll it as many times as you want. It's a little bit shorter than the main, like if you're going through that world on campaign. So it makes it a little bit easier to continuously play this level over and over again, which I actually really liked. I think that makes the game incredibly replayable. I've said this already too many times in this video, but I just think it's fascinating that I can play the one world and we can just have totally and vastly different experiences. I know that there's probably a ton of bosses that I have yet to fight, a ton of areas I have yet to see, weapons that I haven't even found yet, just because every time you load in, it is completely different. And then the last thing that I want to say is the game's performance. I did play on the PlayStation 5, and for the most part, the game actually ran really well. The only time I've noticed some frame drops is especially when I was playing co-op, and I was the one going to somebody else's world. Whenever I was more or less the host and people were joining mine, I didn't really notice any lag or any glitches per se. A few frame drops here and there, but for the most part, game ran great. It's only $50, so much cheaper than all of the AAA games out now, which I guess this isn't a AAA game. I wouldn't even have guessed. Remnant 2 is absolutely incredible, and I can't believe that I almost passed this game up. This game is so fun, the worlds are so amazing, the boss battles were incredibly fun and super epic, and that is why I'm going to give Remnant 2 a 9.5 out of 10. And honestly, the only thing that's really keeping me from a 10 was the story was kind of meh, and there was a little bit of performance issues, especially with being summoned to other worlds. But like I said, those are kind of nitpicky things. Overall, game is absolutely fantastic. Bosses were great, areas were cool and fun to explore, ton of enemy variety. Like I said, you could be fighting robots and aliens on one, and then fighting vampires, dark elves, I'm not sure really what they were, or werewolves. Lots of variety here, extremely replayable, and the game is only 50 bucks. If you guys haven't played it yet, I highly recommend it. You don't need to play the first game. I didn't play the first game. Story didn't make really much sense anyway, but the gameplay is awesome. And I'm big for gameplay. Gameplay is king, and the gameplay here is fire. But guys, that is going to be it for my thoughts on Remnant 2. Let me know down in the comments below if you guys have played it, what was your favorite part of Remnant 2, and we'll catch you guys on the next video.